Redditor 1. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened at my grandfather's winter wedding. Not because I didn't want to, but because for years I convinced myself it was just another folktale from the mountains of northern Iraq. The kind of story that gets passed around over cups of hot chai when the snow piles high against mud brick walls and the wind howls like a hungry wolf through narrow village streets. But I can't keep pretending anymore, not after what I found in my grandmother's cedar chest last week. The wedding took place in 1939, or maybe it was 1940. Back then, in our village, precise dates mattered less than seasons. What mattered was that it was deep winter, when the mountains wore thick blankets of snow and the sun abandoned us by mid-afternoon. Wedding season, we called it, when families would gather in the few hours of daylight to celebrate new beginnings. I was 12 years old, tasked with helping my aunt prepare the reception building. The air inside smelled of cardamom and wood smoke, warm bodies pressed together against the bitter cold. Outside, the temperature had dropped so low that even the sheep had been brought into their owners' homes, their bleating mixing with the sound of women's ululations and men's deep laughter. Hamid, the wedding singer, arrived just after sunset. I remember him clearly, a tall man with deep-set eyes and tobacco-stained fingers that moved across his aoud strings like spiders weaving silk. His voice could make women weep and old men remember their youth. That night, he wore a thick wool coat over his traditional dress, and his breath came out in white puffs as he stomped snow from his boots. The celebrations began as they always did. The men gathered on one side, the women on the other, though the separation grew less strict as the night wore on. My grandfather, the groom, sat at the head table, his new bride veiled and silent beside him. Platters of rice and lamb made their way through the crowd, and Hamid's voice rose above the festivity, singing songs of love that had echoed through these mountains for generations. It was just past 9 when Hamid announced he needed to relieve himself. In those days, we had no indoor plumbing. Nature's calls meant a trek through the snow to the designated area behind the reception building. "Just a few minutes," he said, setting down his OUD. "Play the drums until I return." My uncle Hassan, who had been watching Hamid with unusual intensity all evening, nudged me. "Follow him," he whispered. "Make sure he doesn't get lost in the storm." I didn't question the order. In our culture, children obeyed their elders without hesitation. I grabbed my heavy coat and slipped out after Hamid. The night was bright, despite the late hour, the full moon turning the snow-covered landscape into something alien and beautiful. Hamid's footprints led away from the building, dark holes in the pristine white. I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't notice me, using the excuse of my duty to indulge my childhood curiosity. The wind carried his voice back to me, but he wasn't singing. He was speaking to someone, his words lost in the gusts that whipped between the buildings. I crept closer, pressing myself against the rough stone wall of the reception hall. "How far?" I heard him ask. "That's impossible." Then I saw them. They stood on either side of Hamid, tall figures that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Their movements were too fluid, too precise, like water flowing uphill. I couldn't make out their faces. Later, I would be grateful for this, but I could see their hands on Hamid's arms, long fingers wrapping around his biceps like pale roots. Above them, suspended in the air like a dark tear in the fabric of the night, was something my mind refused to properly process. It was as if a piece of the sky had been cut away, revealing something vast and wrong behind it. A soft humming filled my ears, more felt than heard, like the vibration of a massive tuning fork. I should have screamed. I should have run back to the wedding and raised the alarm. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as Hamid was led toward that impossible darkness. Just before they reached it, he turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. There was something else there, something I wouldn't understand until many years later. Wonder. Then they were gone, swallowed by that tear in the night. The humming peaked briefly before fading, leaving only the wind and the distant sounds of celebration from the reception hall. I waited there, my feet growing numb in the snow, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The wedding guests began to notice Hamid's extended absence. Search parties were organized. My uncle Hassan questioned me sharply about what I'd seen, but I said nothing about the figures or the darkness in the sky. Who would have believed a child's fantasy? Just as the search parties were about to set out, Hamid returned. He walked through the door as if he'd never left, but everything about him was wrong. His clothes were dry despite the snow. His face had a slight sheen to it, like fever, sweat frozen on his skin. And in his hands, he carried an impossible bouquet. The flowers were like nothing we'd ever seen in our mountain village. Delicate petals in shades of pink and white, with leaves of deepest green. The kind of flowers that only grew in warm, distant places. Not here, not in the dead of winter, not in the harsh mountain climate where even the hardiest plants lay dormant under the snow. "A gift," he said, his voice oddly flat. "From friends I met on my walk." The celebrations resumed, but something had changed. The music, when Hamid played again, had a different quality to it. The notes seemed to hang in the air too long, and his familiar songs took on strange, foreign rhythms that made some of the older women cross themselves and mutter prayers. I watched him throughout the night, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, his hands would stray to his coat pocket, where he'd tucked one of those impossible flowers. His fingers would trace its petals with a touch that seemed both reverent and afraid. The wedding ended as all weddings do, with tired guests making their way home through the snow. Hamid declined offers of lodging, insisting he needed to return to his own village that night. No one argued. There was something about him now that made people uneasy, though they couldn't say exactly why. I never saw him again after that night. There were rumors. He'd moved to the city. He'd gone mad. He'd walked into the mountains one spring morning and never returned. But his story became just another tale to tell around the fire, a piece of folklore to entertain children and tourists. Until last week, my grandmother passed away in her sleep, leaving behind the cedar chest that had sat at the foot of her bed for as long as anyone could remember. As the eldest granddaughter, it fell to me to sort through its contents: old photographs, letters, pieces of embroidery she'd never finished. At the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, I found a dried flower. Its petals had turned brown with age, but they still held their shape. Delicate, exotic, impossible. And underneath it, written in my grandmother's careful hand on a scrap of paper, were words that made my blood run cold. They promised him China, but I don't think that's where they took him. The flowers aren't from any place on Earth, and sometimes, on winter nights when the moon is full, I still hear his music on the wind. But the songs aren't in any language I know. I've pressed the flower between the pages of my diary, though I'm not sure why. Perhaps as proof that this all really happened, that I wasn't just a child with an overactive imagination that night, or perhaps as a warning. Because lately, I've been hearing music on the wind too, and last night, when I looked out my window, I saw two tall figures standing in the snow, their long fingers beckoning. Above them, the sky seemed to ripple, like fabric about to tear. They're waiting for me, and I think this time they're going to show me where those flowers really came from. Redditor 2. I've never told many people about what happened that Thanksgiving break during my junior year of college. Not because I don't remember it clearly, God knows I do, but because even now, years later, I still can't make sense of it. Some experiences defy explanation, leaving you with nothing but questions that gnaw at the edges of your mind on sleepless nights. It was 2016, and my friend Marcus had invited me and our buddy Dave to spend Thanksgiving with his family in eastern Montana. Marcus lived in what he proudly called the middle of nowhere, a small farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields and big sky country. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and the nearest city was 3 hours beyond that. Perfect conditions, as Marcus always said, for stargazing. Marcus was the astronomer of our little group. He could name every constellation, track the movements of planets, and tell you exactly when the International Space Station would pass overhead. Dave and I were more casual observers, content to marvel at the basic wonders of a clear night sky. But Marcus's enthusiasm was infectious, and when he suggested we head out to Miller's Field after dinner for some proper stargazing, we readily agreed. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s that night, typical for late November in Montana. We bundled up in thick winter coats, scarves, and gloves before heading out. The moon was just a sliver, making the stars seem impossibly bright against the black canvas of night. The tall grass of Miller's Field swayed around our knees as we walked, creating soft whispers in the darkness. "Look, there's Cassiopeia," Marcus pointed out, tracing the distinctive W shape with his finger. And over there, that's the Pleiades cluster. We spent about an hour like that, Marcus playing tour guide to the cosmos, while Dave and I tried to follow his explanations. The shooting stars were a bonus. We counted 6 of them, each one drawing excited whoops from our little group. Then Dave spotted it. "Hey, what's that bright one there?" He pointed to a light that seemed to hover just above the horizon. It was larger than any star I'd ever seen, with a peculiar bluish-white glow that somehow felt wrong. Marcus frowned, consulting his phone's astronomy app. "That's weird. There shouldn't be any visible planets in that part of the sky right now." We watched as the light began to move, not across the sky like a satellite or plane, but up and down, as if someone was holding a lantern and gently bouncing it. The movement was subtle at first, then became more pronounced. Then, without warning, the light flickered violently and vanished, like a candle being snuffed out. "Well, that was weird," Dave laughed nervously. "Maybe it was a drone or something?" We tried to joke about it, making the usual UFO quips, but something about that light had unsettled us. Maybe that's why we almost missed him at first, the figure sitting in the grass about 50 yards away. I remember the moment perfectly. Marcus was in the middle of some crack about alien abduction when his flashlight beam swept across the field and caught a flash of pale skin. We all froze. The man was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. He wore nothing but a pair of jeans, no shirt, no shoes, no protection against the bitter cold. Even from a distance, I could see his body shaking. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the empty field. "Are you okay?" The man's head turned toward us with an unnatural slowness. His face was young, probably around our age, but his eyes, there was something vacant about them, like looking into empty windows of an abandoned house. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice oddly flat despite his violent shivering. The words came out in visible puffs of condensation. We approached cautiously, every instinct screaming that something was deeply wrong about this situation. The field had been empty minutes ago. We would have seen anyone walking through the knee-high grass. Yet here he was, as if he'd materialized from the darkness itself. "You must be freezing," I said, already unzipping my coat. "Here, take this." He accepted the coat without a word, his skin pale as milk in the beam of Marcus's flashlight. Up close, I noticed strange marks on his shoulders, 3 perfectly parallel lines on each side, like surgical incisions that had recently healed. "How did you get out here?" Dave asked. The man's eyes darted between us, then up to the sky, where we'd seen the light. I don't want to talk about it. I need to go to the hospital." Marcus called 911, while we walked the man to the gas station at the highway intersection. He barely spoke during the 20-minute walk, except to ask our names and a few oddly specific questions about constellations. When I told him my name, he repeated it slowly, as if trying to memorize the sound of it. The police and ambulance arrived quickly, but the paramedics' reactions told us this was no ordinary case. I caught fragments of their conversation: severe hypothermia, unusual markings, temporal disorientation. They wrapped him in thermal blankets and loaded him into the ambulance. As they closed the doors, he looked directly at me through the window, and I swear I saw something shift behind his eyes, like static on an old TV screen. I never got my coat back. The next morning, over a breakfast of leftover turkey and pumpkin pie, Marcus's family listened to our story with polite skepticism. They suggested the man was probably on drugs, or maybe had wandered away from a nearby farm. Simple explanations for a simple mystery. But later that day, while helping Marcus's mom with the dishes, I overheard her talking on the phone with someone from the local hospital. Apparently, they had no record of any hypothermia patient being admitted the night before. When she called the sheriff's office to follow up, they had no record of the incident either. I've thought about that night many times since then, usually around Thanksgiving, when the air turns cold and the stars seem to shine a little brighter. Sometimes I wonder if we really saw what we think we saw, or if our minds have played tricks on us over the years. But then I remember those 3 perfect lines on his shoulders and how he appeared in that field as if from nowhere, and I know it was real. Whatever it was we encountered that night, it wasn't human, at least not entirely. And sometimes on clear nights when I look up at the stars, I catch myself searching for that strange, bobbing light, hoping I never find it. Because whoever, or whatever, we met in Millersfield that night wasn't lost. They were left behind. Redditor 3. I used to think I was good at telling dreams from reality. That was before the summer everything started bleeding together, before I learned that sometimes the line between imagination and truth isn't just blurry, it's non-existent. It began during my vacation to Lake Geneva. I'd rented a cabin for 2 weeks, hoping to finish my novel away from Seattle's constant rain. The first few nights were peaceful, filled with nothing but the sound of crickets and gentle waves lapping at the shore. Then came Thursday. I woke up at 3:17 a.m., the red digits of my alarm clock burning through the darkness. Except I wasn't really awake, not in the traditional sense. My body felt like it was made of concrete, my limbs refusing to respond to the panic building in my chest. The air had changed, becoming thick and electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. That's when I saw them. They moved through the wall as if it were made of smoke, 3 slender figures with elongated heads and eyes that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. I tried to scream, but my throat was frozen. One of them reached toward me with impossibly long fingers, and suddenly my mind felt like it was being unraveled, thought by thought. This is just sleep paralysis, I told myself. I've read about this. It's normal, natural, scientific. But if that was true, why could I smell them? They had an odd metallic scent, like ozone and copper pennies. And why did the air shimmer around them like heat waves rising from hot asphalt? I blacked out. When I came to, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and my sheets were soaked with sweat. I spent the morning convincing myself it had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. Then it happened again, and again. Each night they came, and each night they dug a little deeper into my mind. I started seeing flashes during the day, fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. A vast chamber filled with floating bodies. The curve of Earth, seen from impossibly high up. The sensation of moving through solid matter as easily as air. I tried everything to stop the visits, sleeping pills, energy drinks to stay awake. I even drew crosses on the walls with permanent marker, much to the landlord's future annoyance. Nothing worked. The worst part wasn't the violations of my mind. It was the growing suspicion that they weren't just observing. They were preparing me for something. On the 10th night, I decided I'd had enough. Before going to bed, I spent hours meditating, focusing on a single thought. This is my mind, my space, my rules. I visualized myself as a fortress, impenetrable and armed. When they came that night, something was different. I could still feel their presence pressing against my consciousness, but this time, I pushed back. The paralysis tried to take hold, but I fought through it, imagining my will as a blade cutting through their influence. The tallest one reached for me, its fingers almost brushing my forehead. In that moment, I felt something snap into place in my mind, a connection I hadn't noticed before. And through that connection, I could sense their surprise, their uncertainty, their fear. I surged upward, my dream body finally responding, and in my hand materialized exactly what I'd been visualizing all evening. A sword made of pure thought, gleaming with the light of my own consciousness. The blade moved faster than thought, and the first entity dissolved into a shower of silver mist. The others recoiled, their huge eyes widening even further. They tried to retreat, to phase back through the wall, but I was faster now, moving with the logic of dreams. The sword sang through the air twice more, and then I was alone in the darkness. I woke up naturally the next morning, feeling more rested than I had in weeks. The visitations stopped after that night. I finished my novel, went home to Seattle, and tried to file the whole experience away under stress-induced hallucinations. That worked for about 3 years. Last night, I was awakened by my phone ringing at 3:17 a.m. The caller ID was blank. When I answered, there was only static, but buried in the white noise, I heard words that made my blood freeze. You taught them fear, now they're ready to teach it back to you. I'm writing this now because I can feel the air starting to change, becoming thick and electric. My limbs are getting heavy, but this time, I'm ready. The sword of thought still hangs in my mind, sharp as ever. They wanted to know if humans could fight back in the dream world. They learned we could. What they don't seem to understand is that they've given us something far more dangerous than any weapon. They've given us practice. I can hear them coming now, moving through the walls. But they're not the only ones who've evolved. This time, I'm not waiting for them to reach me. This time, I'm going to show them what human nightmares look like. After all, they're the ones who taught me how to move through solid matter. Redditor 4. The sound woke me from a dead sleep, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of my house. At first, I thought it was the furnace acting up again, but this was different, deeper, almost subsonic. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before your ears register it. The digital clock on my nightstand read 4:13 a.m. Outside my window, snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, illuminated by the streetlights. I needed water. My throat was desert dry, probably from running the heat too high. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, trailing my fingers along the wall to steady myself in the dark. The humming grew louder as I reached the kitchen. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like standing inside a massive tuning fork. My water glass trembled slightly on the counter as I filled it, creating tiny concentric ripples on the surface. That's when I saw the light. It started as a subtle glow through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across my tile floor. But this wasn't the warm yellow of a car's headlights or the harsh white of security floodlights. This light had a bluish silver quality, like mercury in motion. I should have stayed inside, should have gone back to bed, pulled the covers over my head, and convinced myself it was all a dream. Instead, I found myself walking to the back door, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The moment I stepped onto my back porch, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The air temperature must have been well below freezing, but I barely noticed. My attention was completely captured by what hung in the sky above my house. It was perfectly circular, maybe 40 feet in diameter, with a metallic surface that seemed to both reflect and emit light. The object hovered silently now, the humming having ceased the instant I opened the door. Snow swirled around it, but never seemed to land on its surface. I stood there, barefoot in the snow, my breath forming crystals in the air. Time became meaningless. It could have been seconds or hours that I stared up at it, my neck craned back, my body completely immobile. Not from fear, though I was terrified, but from something else, something external. Then it moved. The ascent was gradual at first, a gentle lifting that barely disturbed the air. But once it reached a certain height, the object suddenly accelerated with impossible speed, leaving a brief distortion in the clouds before vanishing completely. I stumbled back inside, my feet numb from the cold, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. Sleep seemed impossible, but somehow I must have dozed off because I started dreaming. In the dream, I was floating. White walls, bright lights, familiar faces that weren't faces at all, long fingers, cold metal, pain that wasn't quite pain. The typical abduction scenario my mind would naturally construct after such an experience, but something was wrong with this dream. The details were too sharp, too specific. I could smell an odd, clinical odor, like antiseptic mixed with ozone. I could feel the different textures under my back. First cold metal, then something soft and organic that seemed to pulse. And most disturbing of all, I could feel the weight and pressure of foreign thoughts pressing against my consciousness, trying to convince me that this wasn't real, that it was just a dream. I woke up in my bed the next morning, sun streaming through my window. Everything was normal, too normal. The snow in the backyard was pristine and unbroken, without a single footprint. The water glass was back in the cupboard, though I distinctly remembered leaving it on the counter. The house was warm, the furnace humming its familiar tune. It's been 3 months since that night. I've almost convinced myself it was just a vivid dream, a product of too much late-night television and an overactive imagination. Almost. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the morning, I hear that hum again, not from outside this time, from inside my head. And in those moments, I become absolutely certain of 3 things. First, what I saw that night was real. Second, what I remember as a dream wasn't a dream at all. And third, they're not finished with me. I know this because every morning I find my water glass in a different place than where I left it the night before. sometimes on the counter, sometimes in the sink, sometimes back in the cupboard. And every single time, there are tiny concentric ripples on the surface of the water, as if responding to a sound just below the threshold of human hearing. They're watching me write this now. I can feel them at the edges of my consciousness, trying to make me doubt, trying to blur the lines between reality and dream. But I know what I saw. I know what they did. And I know they're coming back. The hum is getting louder. Redditor 5. Aunt Mira only spoke of that night in Turkey once, and only after 3 glasses of homemade vodka at my cousin's wedding in 2018. I'd heard whispers of the story before, fragments passed between relatives in hushed tones when they thought the children weren't listening. But Mira was there. She saw it with her own eyes. "We don't talk about these things," she said, her weathered hands clutching her glass. "Some memories are better left in the past." But the alcohol had loosened her tongue, and I sensed this might be my only chance to hear the truth about what happened that summer in 1994. The family had fled Ukraine during the economic collapse, taking what little savings they had to rent a small cottage on the Turkish coast. It was meant to be a respite, a few weeks of peace, before returning to face whatever awaited them back home. The cottage sat on a rocky peninsula, far enough from the nearest village that on clear nights you could see every star in the sky. "We were lucky to find it," Mira told me, her accent thickening with memory. "So cheap because it was off-season. No tourists, no neighbors, just us, the sea, and the dogs." The dogs belonged to the property owner, 3 large Anatolian shepherds that patrolled the grounds at night. They were working dogs, not pets, and normally quiet, except when warning of wolves or jackals. On their 4th night at the cottage, Uncle Victor was teaching my young cousins to play chess when the dogs began to bark. Not their usual alert barks, but something different, something wrong. "It was like they were screaming," Mira said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Like they knew something we didn't." Uncle Dmitri, always the brave one, went to investigate. He was a former military man who didn't believe in ghosts or superstition. He stepped onto the cottage's small porch, expecting to find a wild animal or perhaps an intruder. Instead, he saw lights in the sky. "Not stars," Mira insisted. "Not planes. We lived near an airbase back home. We knew what planes looked like at night." This was something else, a massive triangular shape moving silently through the clouds, each corner marked by a pulsing light that seemed to shift between colors in a way that hurt the eyes. As it descended toward the cottage, Dmitri called for the others. "Come see," he shouted. "Come see what God has sent us." They gathered on the porch, Mira, Victor, their spouses, the children, even Baba Olena, their grandmother, who crossed herself repeatedly and began reciting prayers. The object was so close now, they could see patterns on its surface, like circuits etched into dark metal. The air felt thick, charged with electricity. Static made their hair stand on end. That's when the shaking began. "The whole cottage moved like it was made of paper," Mira said. "Plates fell from shelves. Windows rattled in their frames. The children were crying, but we couldn't hear them over the vibration." The dogs had gone silent. For 7 minutes, Mira was certain of the time because she had stared at her watch, unable to look up at the thing hovering above them. The cottage shook. No one spoke. No one moved. They stood frozen, a family portrait in terror, while something beyond their understanding observed them from above. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the object rose straight up into the sky, accelerating at an impossible speed until it vanished among the stars. They spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, they found the dogs huddled beneath the porch, whimpering. All 3 animals had gone completely white, their once dark fur bleached by something none of them could explain. The family cut their vacation short, driving back to Ukraine the next day. They never spoke of that night to outsiders, and rarely to each other. Some experiences, Mira explained, are too big for words, too strange for the mind to properly hold. "But why keep it secret?" I asked her. "Why not tell people what you saw?" Mira finished her vodka and fixed me with a steady gaze. "Because, child, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some knowledge changes you forever. We saw something that night that shouldn't exist, And sometimes she glanced around the wedding reception, at our family dancing and laughing, living their normal lives. Sometimes I think it saw us too. She never mentioned it again. When she passed away last winter, she took most of the story with her. But on clear nights, when I see 3 stars arranged in a triangle, I think about that cottage in Turkey, and the dogs whose fur turned white, and the secrets families keep to protect themselves from truths too heavy to bear. And I wonder what else is out there, watching us from above, deciding whether or not to make itself known. Redditor. 6. Every time I pass through airport security, my right palm tingles where the metal used to be. Phantom sensations, the doctors called it, like an amputee feeling their missing limb. But amputees don't have security guards wave metal detectors over their hands with puzzled expressions. They don't have priests asking why they flinched during communion. They don't spend 20 years wondering if what happened that night was really just a dream. I was 8 when they came for me. That's not dramatic phrasing. It's the simplest way to describe what happened. I remember lying in my bed, watching shadows from the maple tree dance across my ceiling. Mom was working the night shift at the hospital, and Mrs. Peterson, our regular babysitter, was downstairs watching Late Night with David Letterman. I could hear the muffled sound of audience laughter drifting up through the heating vent. When the window started to open, I did what I'd perfected through years of practice. I played dead. It was my superpower, this ability to convince adults I was sleeping. It had gotten me out of Sunday school more times than I could count, earned me countless carries from the car to my bed. I kept my breathing steady, my eyes closed but relaxed, just like I'd practiced. I felt hands lift me, too long, too cold, and expected to hear Mrs. Peterson's voice scolding me for pretending. Instead, there was only silence and the sensation of rising. Not like being carried upstairs, but like an elevator with no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just up, up, up into the night air. The rational part of my mind, even at 8, knew this was a dream. Had to be a dream. I'd had flying dreams before, but flying dreams didn't smell like ozone and copper pennies. They didn't make your skin prickle like static electricity. They didn't feel so real. I kept my eyes closed until the movement stopped. The air had changed, become thicker, warmer, charged with something that made my teeth ache. When I finally looked, I found myself in a space that my child's mind couldn't properly process. The walls seemed to breathe. The reddish light came from everywhere and nowhere. And the figures. I've spent 20 years trying to remember what they looked like. My mind skips over their features like a scratched DVD, refusing to focus. But I remember their hands. God, I remember their hands. There was a pinch on my left hand, sharp but quick. Then another on my right palm, a sensation like ice water flowing under my skin. Then nothing. I woke up in my bed, tears already streaming down my face. I ran downstairs to Mrs. Peterson, who held me while I sobbed. "Just a nightmare," she said, stroking my hair. "Everyone has bad dreams." But bad dreams don't leave scars. The mark on my left hand looked like a perfect circle, smaller than a dime, raised in pink like a fresh burn. But it was the right palm that haunted me. Just beneath the skin, something moved, something metal, round, about the size of a ball bearing, shifting slightly whenever I made a fist. The next 5 years were a parade of doctors, specialists, dermatologists. They took x-rays that showed nothing. They ordered MRIs I couldn't get because the metal reacted too strongly to the machine. They biopsied the skin around it but found nothing unusual. Just typical human tissue with an atypical metallic inclusion that shouldn't have been there. The thing had a mind of its own. It would heat up near power lines, cool down in churches. Airport metal detectors went crazy. Sometimes the skin would bubble up around it, forming perfect geometric patterns before settling back down. Once, during a thunderstorm, it glowed faintly blue. I never had it surgically removed, partly because of a childhood fear of anesthesia, but mostly because I liked it. It made me special, different. It was proof that something extraordinary had happened to me, even if I couldn't fully remember or explain it. 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days after that night, I woke up to find a small, perfectly spherical ball bearing on my pillow. The skin of my palm had simply released it, leaving behind a small gray mark like a tattoo. Under a microscope, the metal showed no signs of corrosion or wear. It was seamless, impossibly smooth, and completely inert. I kept it in a small box on my dresser for years, but one day it was simply gone. No sign of forced entry, no explanation, just gone, like it had never existed. But the scars remained. The one on my left hand faded to a thin white circle, barely visible unless you know where to look. The gray mark on my right palm never changed, a perfect map of where the metal sat for 5 years. I'm 38 now. I have a family, a career, a normal life. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring at my palm, remembering the weight of that foreign object beneath my skin, wondering what it was recording, what it was transmitting, what it was waiting for. And sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I swear I can feel my window starting to open. Redditor 7. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my brother Marcus was during our weekly video call. It was late October, and the sun had already set in Portland, leaving my apartment bathed in the blue glow of my laptop screen. Marcus looked tired, more than usual for an ER nurse working night shifts. "Remember when we used to go camping with Dad?" he asked abruptly, interrupting my story about my latest photography project. His voice had an odd, urgent quality to it. "Of course," I said. "Those trips to Mount Hood every summer?" "No, Sarah. The other camping trips, the ones where the sky turned green." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Marcus leaned closer to his webcam, his face filling my screen. "I've been remembering things that don't make sense, but I know they happened, like those nights when we were kids and the camping trips weren't really camping trips." "Marcus, you're not making sense. Are you feeling okay?" He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood. "I thought I was losing it at first. Started having these dreams about 3 months ago. Except they're not dreams. They're memories. Coming back piece by piece, like someone uploaded them into my brain with corrupted files." I wanted to dismiss it as stress or exhaustion, but something in his voice made me pause, made me think about those strange gaps in my childhood memories, the ones I'd always attributed to the natural erosion of time. "Tell me," I said. "They looked almost human, but not quite. Beige, not gray like everyone says. They had a room where the walls could see inside you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're coming back, Sarah. Soon. They told me, but I wasn't supposed to remember. None of us were." That was the last time I spoke to my brother. The next morning, his apartment was empty. No signs of struggle, no note. Just his phone on the kitchen counter, open to a note he'd been writing. "The memories are bleeding through. They're not supposed to, but they are. I think it's happening to others too. We need to..." That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been piecing together the truth, finding others like Marcus who've started remembering, who've started disappearing. The authorities are no help. They file missing persons reports and make sympathetic noises, but they don't see the pattern. They don't want to see it. But I see it. And I'm writing this down because I'm starting to remember too. Little things at first. The smell of ozone and bluegrass music played too fast. The sensation of being watched by walls that pulse with soft light. The taste of copper in my mouth, and the sound of voices that feel like humming in my bones. Last night, I remembered something new. I was 12, and Marcus was 14. We weren't really camping on Mount Hood. We were somewhere else, somewhere the stars looked wrong. They showed us videos of the past, ancient cities, lost civilizations, moments in history no human eye had ever captured. They told us we were helping them understand, but I don't think that was true anymore. I'm writing this from a motel room in Eastern Oregon. My phone keeps showing messages from numbers that don't exist, coordinates to places that aren't on any map. Earlier today, I saw a beige van parked outside my room. No one got in or out, but I could hear music playing faintly through the walls, a 13-stringed African instrument I somehow knew the name of, but couldn't pronounce. They're coming for me soon. I can feel it. But before they do, you need to know what's happening. They've been here all along, collecting memories, collecting moments, collecting us. And now, something's changed. The program, whatever it is shifting. The memories they tried to take, the ones they locked away in our minds, They're breaking free. I found a notebook in Marcus's apartment after he disappeared. Most of the pages were blank, but on the last page, he'd written a series of dates. The final one is July 8th, 2021. Below it, in shaky handwriting, the walls between then and now are getting thin. They didn't want us to remember, but we do, and that changes everything. If you're reading this, you might start remembering too. Little things at first, dreams that feel too real, memories that don't fit with what you know to be true. You might hear bluegrass music in places it shouldn't be, or catch glimpses of beige shapes in your peripheral vision. You might find yourself drawing star patterns that don't match any constellation, or humming songs in frequencies human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Don't ignore these memories, but don't let them know you remember either. I've been documenting everything I can remember, encrypting files, sending copies to secure servers. This isn't just my story, or Marcus's story. It's happening all over. People are remembering, and people are vanishing. The ones who talk too much go first. The ones who ask too many questions. Yesterday, I remembered something else. Something they showed us in that room with the living walls. A future that hasn't happened yet, but will. Cities empty of people. Buildings filled with walls that watch and remember. A vast archive of human experience, collected one memory at a time. I think I know now why they chose children, why they've been taking us up there every few years, harvesting our experiences, our emotions, our memories. We're not test subjects. We're not even study specimens. We're their entertainment, their art gallery, their living museum. The sun is setting now, and I can hear that music again, drifting through the thin motel walls. 13 strings, playing impossible melodies. They're getting closer. But I need you to understand what's coming. Need you to know why people like my brother are remembering, why they're vanishing. Something changed in their program. A glitch maybe, or a deliberate release. The memories they collected, the ones they stored and studied and shared among themselves, they're flowing back into us. All of us. And with those memories come others, glimpses of their world, their plans, their true purpose. I have to stop writing now. There's a shadow outside my door that doesn't match any object casting it, and the air tastes like copper and ozone. If you're reading this, you're part of it too, whether you remember yet or not. We all are. We always were. Just remember, when the memories start coming back, when you start questioning what you know to be true, stay quiet, stay hidden. Don't let them know you remember. Don't let them know you understand what they've been doing all along. And if you hear bluegrass music playing somewhere it shouldn't be, if you see beige shapes in the corner of your eye, if you find yourself humming songs that make your teeth vibrate, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, but they'll still find you. They always do. Because the thing about memories is, they don't just belong to us anymore. They never did. Found on a laptop in room 237 of the Pine View Motel, Highway 20, Oregon. No trace of the guest was ever discovered. The only other item in the room was a small recorder playing bluegrass music on an endless loop. Redditor 8. I never wanted to fall in love with the stars, but sometimes the universe has other plans, and they unfold in ways that make you question everything you thought you knew about reality, about connection, about love itself. It started 2 years ago, on what seemed like an ordinary August night in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I was walking my dog, Max, a 13-year-old golden retriever who'd been with me through divorce, job changes, and the kind of loneliness that comes from living in a small coastal town where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows you. The night was clear, one of those perfect late summer evenings when the humidity finally breaks and the air feels clean enough to drink. Living along the Atlantic has its perks, and one of them is the sky. Away from Boston's light pollution, the stars put on a show that makes you understand why ancient civilizations built their entire mythologies around them. I stopped at my usual spot, a small clearing overlooking the bay, where the old Ferguson house used to stand before the storm of '98 took it. Max settled into his familiar routine of sniffing every blade of grass while I fumbled for my cigarettes, a habit I'd been trying to quit for longer than I cared to admit. The lighter's flame briefly conquered the darkness, and that's when everything changed. If I'd looked up 2 seconds earlier or later, I would have missed them entirely. But by some cosmic coincidence, I lifted my eyes to the heavens at exactly the right moment. At first, I thought they were satellites. I'd seen plenty of those before, little moving dots tracking their predictable paths across the night sky. But these were different. Two faint objects, barely visible against the backdrop of stars, moving in ways that defied everything I knew about orbital mechanics. They danced. That's the only word for it. While satellites and space debris follow straight lines dictated by gravity and momentum, these objects wove patterns through the sky like figure skaters on an invisible rink. They'd drift apart, then come together again in what looked almost like a courtship ritual. Sometimes they'd stop completely, hovering in place as if contemplating their next move. I remember dropping my cigarette, unlit, watching it fall in slow motion as my eyes remained fixed on the aerial ballet above. Max had gone still too, his head tilted skyward in an uncharacteristic display of attention. What happened next is where things get complicated. My memories of that night have gaps, like a book with pages torn out. I know I must have gone home eventually. I woke up in my bed the next morning, but the space between watching those lights and finding myself under my covers is a blank spot in my mind, a void that shouldn't exist. The strange thing is, I wasn't scared, not then and not now. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child looking up at my first meteor shower. Pure, unadulterated wonder. More than that, I felt a connection, a profound sense that whatever I was witnessing was meant for me to see. That feeling of connection didn't fade with the night. If anything, it grew stronger in the days and weeks that followed. I found myself drawn back to that clearing, night after night, sometimes with Max, sometimes alone after he became too tired for our long walks. The lights didn't appear again, but something had changed in me. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way the tide pulled at the shore felt like a conversation between Earth and Moon. The patterns of migrating birds seemed to carry messages I could almost, but not quite, understand. Even the wind through the trees sounded different, like a language just beyond the edge of comprehension. Max passed away that winter. I buried him in the backyard under his favorite maple tree, and that night, I swear the stars shone brighter than usual, as if they were acknowledging his departure. I sat in the cold for hours, smoking cigarette after cigarette, remembering how he'd watched those lights with me. That's when the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, far from it. I dreamed of vast spaces between stars, of journeys so long they made human lifespans seem like breaths. I dreamed of beings who experience time differently than we do, to whom a human life is both infinitesimally brief and infinitely precious. They showed me things in these dreams, though showed isn't quite the right word. They shared experiences, emotions, understanding. I learned that love isn't unique to Earth. It exists everywhere, in forms we can barely comprehend. The lights I saw weren't ships or probes or whatever you might imagine. They were more like messages, postcards from across the cosmos saying, "You are not alone. We feel too. We love too." The dreams continued for months. Sometimes they were vivid, full of impossible colors and geometric patterns that made perfect sense while I was asleep but slipped away upon waking. Other times, they were subtle, leaving me with nothing but a lingering feeling of peace and understanding. I started keeping a dream journal, trying to capture these experiences before they faded. The pages filled with drawings of spiraling galaxies, descriptions of emotions that have no names in any human language, and attempts to explain concepts that our minds aren't built to grasp. One entry from last March stands out. They showed me love tonight, not human love, though that was part of it. They showed me how love looks from outside time, how it connects everything that has ever been or will be. The lights I saw weren't dancing. They were loving. The same way we might hold hands or kiss, they were expressing something fundamental about existence itself. People in town started noticing changes in me. The perpetual cloud of melancholy that had followed me since my divorce lifted. I quit smoking without really trying. It just didn't seem important anymore. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter, feeling a need to channel this new understanding of connection into something tangible. Sarah at the coffee shop said I seemed lighter somehow, Old Mr. Peterson, who'd known me since I was a kid, said I reminded him of his wife before she passed. Someone who knows something beautiful that they can't quite explain. I tried telling a few people about what I'd seen that night. Most reacted the way you'd expect. Polite nods, concerned looks, quick changes of subject. My sister suggested I talk to someone, meaning a therapist. My best friend Dave listened more openly, but I could tell he thought it was grief over Max, manifesting in an unusual way. Maybe they're right. Maybe that night broke something in my brain, or maybe I'm reconstructing a simple event into something more meaningful to cope with loss and loneliness. I've considered these possibilities more times than I can count. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter. Whether those lights were alien beings expressing cosmic love or satellites catching the sun in an unusual way, the effect was real. The connection I felt, the understanding that flooded through me, the profound sense that love transcends our limited human experience, all of that changed me in ways I can't deny. I still go to the clearing most clear nights. Max's absence is a physical ache beside me, but I feel him there sometimes, in the way the grass moves in the breeze, or how the stars seem to wink at just the right moment. I don't smoke anymore, but I bring a thermos of coffee and sit for hours, watching the sky. The lights haven't returned, at least not in any way I can perceive with my eyes, but sometimes, in that space between sleeping and waking, I feel them. They're out there, dancing their eternal dance of love and connection, reminding us that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves. Last week, I met someone at the animal shelter, a woman who just moved to town and was looking to adopt a dog. As we walked through the kennels, our conversation drifted to the night sky, to unexplained experiences, to the nature of connection. She told me about a night in Arizona when she saw something she couldn't explain, and the same look of wonder I'd felt crossed her face. We're having coffee next weekend. I don't know if anything will come of it, but for the first time since that August night, I feel a different kind of connection forming. A human one, yes, but somehow enhanced by what I learned from those distant lights. Because that's the real message they shared with me. Love isn't just an emotion or a chemical reaction in our brains. It's a force as fundamental as gravity, as universal as light itself. It exists in the spaces between stars and in the quiet moments between heartbeats. It's in the way Max used to lean against my leg during our walks, in the dance of mysterious lights against the night sky, and in the smile of a stranger who just might understand. I'm still a truth seeker, still forever in search of true love. But now I understand that the truth and love are the same thing. They're both about connection, about reaching across the void to touch something bigger than ourselves. Those lights showed me that. And even if I never see them again, I'll carry that understanding for the rest of my life. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, I look up at the stars and whisper, "Thank you." And sometimes, in ways I can't quite explain, I feel them whisper back. Redditor 9. I've never told anyone this story in full, because honestly, I was afraid people would think I was making it all up. I've never been one to chase conspiracies or obsess over alien abduction reports. But when I was a kid, I had a front row seat to a family drama that revolved around one of the strangest tales I've ever heard. It happened in the late 1970s, when my aunt was married to a highway patrolman named Herbert Sherma. If that name rings a bell, you might have come across it in some UFO literature or stumbled on a video mentioning him on YouTube. People in certain circles know him well. A man who claimed he not only saw a UFO out on a lonely stretch of highway one night, but was actually taken aboard. Growing up, I heard fragments of the story. Some whispered it at Thanksgiving. Others dismissed it outright as the ramblings of a fool. My mother mostly kept quiet, but once in a while, I'd catch her shaking her head, eyes distant, like she was remembering something unsettling. As a kid, I thought it was all a big, spooky legend. But as I got older, I learned that certain parts were documented. The missing time, the hypnosis sessions, the official mention in various abduction accounts. Even the marriage records existed. My aunt was married to Herbert for a couple of years. Then they divorced, and she refused to talk about him after that. Over time, I pieced together the story. This is how I heard it, mostly in hush-hush conversations with family members who were there or who heard it directly from my aunt. I can't promise every detail is gospel truth, but it's what I've come to believe happened. Herbert joined the highway patrol sometime in the mid-70s, a serious, upright guy who took pride in his uniform and the authority it gave him. He was the last man you'd expect to spew out wild stories about UFOs and little green men. According to my aunt, he was conservative, methodical, and not exactly imaginative. He liked order. He liked procedure. He liked that he had a routine: patrol the highways at night, watch for speeders, handle the occasional stranded motorist. So it shocked the entire family when, one summer night, Herbert came home trembling, pale as a sheet, unable to speak more than a few words. He told my aunt that something incredible had happened during his patrol. They'd only been married a few months at that point, and she didn't quite know how to read him yet. Herbert stammered about bright lights, about losing track of his sense of time. She tried to calm him, but his eyes were wide, haunted. He had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's just been through an unimaginable ordeal. When she asked him to explain it clearly, all he could say was, "I saw something over the road. My watch is wrong, and I think my radio was out for a while." The next morning, he filed some kind of report with his superiors. Nothing too dramatic, just that he'd encountered a bright light that might have been a downed aircraft. But he didn't mention anything about missing time to them then, because who would take him seriously? Over the following weeks, though, Herbert's behavior grew erratic. He'd wake up at night drenched in sweat, fighting to breathe. My aunt would find him pacing the living room at 3 a.m, muttering about hands touching me, voices I can't understand. Most unsettling was how he began to complain of nightmares that matched no earthly reference. Tiny glimpses of a sterile metallic room, humming with an electrical buzz that set his nerves on edge. My aunt insisted he see a doctor. They ran the usual tests: blood work, scans of the head, even a psychological evaluation. Everything came back normal. Herbert was physically healthy, maybe a bit stressed, but not insane or delusional. That's when he dropped the bombshell on my aunt. He believed he had been taken aboard a craft. He thought the bright light he'd seen on that remote highway was a UFO, and that some intelligence had pulled him right out of his patrol car and performed procedures on him. He used the word probed, eyes darting like he was ashamed of it. He recalled only flashes, bright instruments, voices that weren't quite English, a sense of floating helplessly. He said they stuck things in him, tested him as though he were a lab rat. Obviously, this shattered my aunt's world. She was mortified, terrified, and worried her husband was losing his mind. At the same time, she knew Herbert wasn't the type to invent tall tales. He was a law enforcement officer, for crying out loud, a man who valued facts and evidence. That tension tore at her. She wanted to trust him, but the story was so bizarre. She urged him to seek help from outside channels, maybe a psychiatrist who specialized in repressed memories or trauma. That's when the idea of hypnosis came up. Through a local UFO research group, yes, those existed even then, Herbert got put in touch with a hypnotherapist known for regressing abduction experiencers. My aunt was skeptical, but Herbert insisted. Under hypnosis, he apparently revealed a wealth of detail that made his story all the more frightening. He described being lifted from his patrol car in a beam of light that neutralized his ability to move. He remembered the inside of the craft as cramped, with low, curved ceilings. He mentioned beings, not short, gray aliens like in modern pop culture, but tall, vaguely humanoid figures whose features he couldn't quite discern. They had long, spindly fingers, he said, and they wore form-fitting suits of a color he couldn't name, something between silver and blue. He recounted how these beings communicated telepathically with one another. He felt the waves of their thought speech, though he couldn't understand the words, and how they strapped him to a table. The table was cold, metallic, and part of it seemed to shift and morph as if it were alive. Instruments emerged from hidden compartments. He felt pricks and vibrations in places he'd never want to feel them. The sense of violation was profound, and even under hypnosis, Herbert's voice quivered with horror. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he mumbled about them, peering into his mind, combing through his memories like flipping through a file cabinet. Eventually, Herbert reported, he was returned to his patrol car, parked exactly where he'd been before. But the clock on his dashboard read 3:17 a.m., over 2 hours past the time he last remembered. His watch was off by the same margin, and the dispatch logs showed that he hadn't responded to any calls for a good 2 to 3 hours. When he tried to radio in, static crackled. Then the signal snapped back, as if someone had flipped a switch. Under normal circumstances, you'd expect a spouse to dismiss all this as a stress-induced hallucination, but the missing time was real. The official record showed he was unaccounted for. No one could figure out what he'd been doing during that window. Plus, the sincerity of his terror was hard to fake. He wasn't boasting or thrilled by the idea of contact with aliens. He was shaken to his core, traumatized. Word got around, as it does in small law enforcement circles, that Herbert was claiming something spectacular. Ridicule followed. Some of his fellow officers teased him, calling him Martian Man, or muttering, "Beam me up, Scotty," when he entered the break room. Others genuinely worried about his mental health. My aunt found the pressure unbearable. She was a private woman who wanted a normal life, and now her husband was at the center of UFO controversies. She tried to stand by him, but her own anxieties mounted. For a while, Herbert was approached by UFO enthusiasts, reporters, and random people who'd read about alien abductions. He ended up in a few published articles. His name changed in one or two for privacy, but eventually it leaked out. Highway patrol officer abducted by UFO in the California desert. He was even interviewed on camera for a small documentary, and later, someone put clips of that interview on YouTube. In it, he looks exhausted, older than his years, detailing how he'd never believed in this stuff before it happened to him. But the attention also brought criticism and doubt. Skeptics accused him of wanting publicity or suffering from stress-induced fantasies. Some tried to pick apart his story's timeline, but the official dispatch logs corroborated that, yes, he was missing for a couple of hours without explanation. My aunt said he'd often break down crying after reading cruel newspaper articles or hearing snide remarks from colleagues. It became more than she could bear. The marriage unraveled. They separated not too long after. My aunt told my mother, who told me, years later, that in her final days of living with Herbert, she'd occasionally wake up in the dead of night to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the window, muttering about how they might come back. He confessed that, in certain dreams, he was still aboard that craft, hearing those telepathic whispers, feeling that cold metal table under his back. She tried to comfort him, but it was as though he'd been marked by something beyond human understanding, and there was no solace in normalcy anymore. After the divorce, Herbert faded from our family's orbit. My aunt remarried eventually, to a man who had no interest in UFOs or the paranormal. She refused to discuss Herbert or his abduction story after that. When I was a teenager, I stumbled on an old newspaper clipping at my grandmother's house, a short article referencing a California Highway Patrol officer's strange encounter. The name was partially visible, Herbert S. I knew who it was. That's when my curiosity peaked. I started poking around libraries, before the internet was as robust as it is now, and found references to a highway patrolman's abduction. I was stunned to learn how widely his story had circulated in UFO circles, yet my own family had tried to bury it. As an adult, I occasionally scrolled through UFO forums or typed Herbert Sherma abduction into search engines. Sure enough, I found the mention of him in a few older documents, and then, eventually, that grainy YouTube video. There he was, older, wearing a collared shirt, recounting the events in a shaky voice. The interview is a snippet from some 80s-era documentary, I think. He looks haunted, as if the ordeal has chipped away at his soul. The video doesn't show the entire hypnosis session, but it does show the aftermath. He's wiping sweat from his brow, eyes red-rimmed. He says something like, "I wish I'd never pulled over. I wish I'd just kept driving." When people ask me if I believe in UFOs, I never really know how to answer. I'm not eager to jump into all the conspiracy theories out there, but I can't dismiss Herbert's story either. The missing time was real, corroborated by official logs. Under hypnosis, he described details that weren't just random nonsense. They matched certain patterns reported by other so-called abductees, beings, bright lights, telepathic communication, medical procedures. Yet he never once acted like he enjoyed the spotlight or gained anything from it. In fact, it cost him his marriage, his peace of mind, and likely his credibility with many of his coworkers. One detail that always stuck with me is something my aunt mentioned only once, after a couple of glasses of wine, years after the divorce. She said Herbert had a small scar behind his ear that he swore hadn't been there before the night of his disappearance. She asked him to get it checked by a doctor, but the doctor brushed it off as a minor skin tag or old wound. Herbert insisted it was new. My aunt told my mother it gave her a creepy, crawling feeling whenever she saw it, like it might be some leftover from an implant or device inserted during the abduction. Of course, there was never any proof, but it contributed to the uneasy atmosphere in their home. There are times I wonder if Herbert was truly singled out by some otherworldly intelligence, or if he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Did these beings, if that's what they were, choose him because he was alone on a deserted highway? Or was he just unfortunate enough to cross paths with a phenomenon we barely understand? The bleakness of his post-abduction life suggests that whatever happened to him offered no grand cosmic revelations, no spiritual awakening, only fear, confusion, and heartbreak. Over the years, I've tried to track down Herbert's whereabouts, hoping to speak with him myself. If he's still alive, he's stayed far off the grid. Maybe he found a way to move on, or maybe he's haunted by the prospect of them returning. Whenever I watch that old video clip online, I feel a pang of sadness. You can see the strain etched into his face, like someone who's had his worldview torn to shreds. He warns people that they shouldn't laugh at abductees because some experiences break a person's spirit, and you can tell he's speaking from a place of raw pain. The mainstream world may never fully accept his testimony. Skeptics will say he fabricated it for attention, or that he had some psychological break, but the folks who investigate UFO claims remain fascinated by the specificity of his memory under hypnosis, especially since he gave those accounts long before certain abduction tropes became popular in movies and TV. He was, in many ways, a reluctant pioneer in that field, a law enforcement officer who didn't want to believe, yet found himself thrust into the center of a cosmic question. For me, it's a reminder that life can be far stranger than we'd like to admit. I can't say I'm a true believer, but when someone asks if I think there's more to existence than our day-to-day reality, I think of Herbert. The desert highway, the bright lights, the blank space of missing hours, the trembling hands, the haunted eyes, the marriage that collapsed under the weight of an unfathomable experience. Part of me wonders what he'd say if we could sit down face to face today. Would he still stand by every word? Has he found any peace? I'll never know for sure. All I have is the family lore and that old YouTube video wherein a deeply troubled man describes the unthinkable. Sometimes, on a late-night drive down a lonely stretch of highway, I catch myself scanning the sky for lights that don't belong. I might slow down if I see something suspiciously bright on the horizon, a reflex I can't quite rationalize away. Because if Herbert's story taught me anything, it's that we often think we're alone on these dark roads, that nothing could possibly tear us from our routines. But maybe, just maybe, there's something out there, watching and waiting. And if it chooses you, logic and order won't stand a chance against whatever's hiding in that cold, star-littered sky. 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 Star-littered